Maria's mind raced. This is not real. I am just tired, just imagining things. I need to keep moving. Turn around. The figure's voice finally spoke. It was deep and rasping, like the groan of a dying tree. Come closer. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her mind. Never look behind you, never call out. The old road stretched ahead, seemingly endless in the dim glow of twilight. It was a kind of path that seemed innocent enough during the day, lined with trees whose thick canopies blocked out the sun, casting the ground in shadow. But by night, it was a different story, one that most people in the village knew all too well. Maria had heard the warnings her whole life. Growing up in a small town, on the edge of the forest, the elders often spoke in hushed voices about the dangers of the Lonely Road, a winding stretch of dirt and gravel that ran between the town and the woods. They told stories of people who had gone missing, travelers who had walked the road after dark, only to be swallowed by the night without a trace. It was said that the road didn't like visitors, and if you weren't careful, it would find a way to keep you. Don't do this when you're passing a lonely road, her grandmother would say whenever she ventured near the woods. Never whistle, never call out, and never ever look behind you. Maria had heard the stories, but she was a skeptic. She wasn't afraid of the shadows or myths. She was used to walking the woods at dusk. And tonight, after a long day at the market, she had taken a shortcut home. It was getting late, but the moon was full, casting enough light to see the path clearly. The village was quiet behind her, and the road stretched dark and empty. As she walked, the night seemed to shift. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a moment, it felt as though the forest itself was watching her, waiting. But Maria shook off the feeling. It was just the weight of the old stories, nothing more. She reached the part of the road where the trees grew thicker, where the moonlight barely reached the ground. It felt colder here, even though it was still summer. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and kept walking. But then a thought crossed her mind, one she hadn't considered before. What if I called out? Maria's mind raced. She had heard the elders' warnings 1,000 times, but the temptation was there. It seemed like a silly thing to do, but what could happen? Surely it was nothing. It wasn't like the road could actually do anything, right? Without thinking, she cleared her throat and called into the darkness ahead. "Hello," she said, her voice breaking the stillness. "Is anyone there?" For a moment, there was nothing but the soft rustle of leaves. Then a faint sound reached her ears, a whisper, so low and soft, it almost seemed like a breeze. Maria froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. "Hello," she called again, louder this time, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Anyone out there?" There was a shift in the air, a sudden tension that made the trees groan under a strange weight. The wind stopped. The night became unnervingly still. And then, as if the darkness itself had responded, a figure appeared at the far end of the road. Maria's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a hood. It was standing motionless, just out of reach of moonlight, as if waiting for someone or something. Maria swallowed hard. She tried to dismiss the rising fear in her chest, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot. "Who is there?" she asked, her voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to shift. A cold, almost suffocating breeze began to swirl around her, carrying with it the faintest of whispers, like a language she couldn't understand. Maria took a step back, then another, but the figure was still there, unmoving, as though it were part of the darkness itself. The whispering grew louder now, as if dozens of voices were murmuring just beyond her reach, all speaking at once, all begging her to listen. Maria's mind raced. This is not real. I am just tired, just imagining things. I need to keep moving. But her feet felt heavy, as though they were no longer her own. She couldn't look away from the figure, and it was as if her body was drawn to it, step by step, despite the panic rising in her chest. "Turn around," the figure's voice finally spoke. It was deep and rasping, like the groan of a dying tree. "Come closer." Maria's heart pounded in her chest. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind. Never look behind you, never call out. She tried to turn and run, but something held her back, something cold and dark, pressing against her chest. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as if the road itself had changed, becoming something twisted and unfamiliar. The trees no longer looked like trees. They were distorted, their branches reaching out like clawed hands, as if to trap her. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. "You called," it said, the words carrying a weight of finality. Maria opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. Her breath was shallow, her limbs frozen in place. The figure was mere feet from her now, its dark empty hood looming closer. And then, just as it seemed the shadow would close in around her, she felt a sudden pull, a gentle tug at her wrist, followed by the faintest whisper in her ear. "Run." It was a voice she knew, her grandmother's voice. The figure hesitated, its presence faltering, as if it was briefly distracted. Maria, her heart racing, seized the moment. She turned and ran, her legs moving faster than she ever thought possible, pushing through the dark twisted path. The air grew lighter as she distanced herself from the figure, the whispers fading into the distance. When she reached the village, out of breath and trembling, she glanced over her shoulder. The road behind her was dark and empty, the forest silent once more. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of the terror that had nearly swallowed her whole. Maria collapsed onto the familiar cobblestone streets, gasping for air, her body shaking. The elders were right. There were things on that road, things that didn't like to be disturbed, things that weren't meant to be seen, and she had learned, in the hardest way possible, that some rules weren't just stories, they were warnings. As she made her way home, still shaking but safe, Maria whispered a prayer thanking the unseen forces that had saved her, knowing now that the road had not only answered her call, it had nearly taken her as payment. "Don't do this when you're passing a lonely road," her grandmother had always said, and now Maria understood, more than ever, why those words were meant to be obeyed. After that incident, Maria joined the elders in warning the villagers to not do those things when passing a lonely road. Maria left the village years later, and even till this day, Maria still warns people around her to not do those things when passing a lonely road. We have to always be careful and prayerful because what exists out there is beyond our imagination. People should learn to put their stubbornness aside and take the advices of those wiser than them, because it is not every time one would get a second chance. Hope you enjoyed this story. See you in my next story.